On October 24, 1942, as night settled thick and wet over the jungle south of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, 3,000 Japanese infantrymen began moving forward through darkness so dense it swallowed sound and distance alike, advancing toward a single exhausted Marine battalion dug into a low, muddy ridgeline that guarded the airfield. And by every rule of military mathematics, this encounter should have ended in slaughter, because the numbers were merciless, 3 attackers for every defender. Elite imperial troops hardened by years of conquest in China and Malaya against Americans who had been living on half rations for 2 months, sick with malaria, hollow-eyed, and worn thin by constant combat, and every infantry manual written since antiquity agreed on the same brutal truth, that when an assault closes to hand-to-hand range, victory belongs to the side that brings more bayonets. And on that night, the Japanese had 3,000 of them, while Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller had barely 700 Marines, yet buried invisibly in the wet earth between those Marines were weapons that would shatter every assumption both armies held about how infantry battles were decided, not heavy machine guns, not artillery firing from miles away, but small steel tubes light enough for a single man to carry, so simple they contained no moving parts beyond gravity and a fixed firing pin. Weapons so unassuming that Japanese intelligence had dismissed them as minor. Support equipment hardly worth noting in pre-battle assessments, and in 4 hours' time those neglected tools would collide violently with a 2,000-year-old code that taught Japanese soldiers how to die, while embodying a 19-year-old idea conceived by a French artist who had once asked a simple question no general had been willing to face: how do you keep infantry alive when courage is no longer enough? That question had been born 23 years earlier in Paris, in 1919, while diplomats negotiated the Treaty of Versailles beneath chandeliers and gilt ceilings, and Edgar Brandt walked alone through his metalworking shop on the Rue de la Fontaine, surrounded by wrought iron gates destined for embassies and museums, an Art Deco master whose reputation rested on his ability to make iron curve and flow like liquid. Yet for 4 years he had not been shaping beauty but weapons, and the great war had taught him a lesson carved in blood across Europe, that armies were not losing because their soldiers lacked bravery, but because geometry itself had betrayed them, because artillery firing from miles behind the front could not drop shells into enemy trenches without killing the men advancing toward them, because heavy mortars that could fire vertically were too cumbersome to move with attacking troops, because machine guns could advance but could not reach enemies hiding behind earth and concrete, leaving a lethal gap between what infantry carried and what artillery could safely deliver, a gap that had consumed an entire generation of French youth. And Brandt, thinking not like a general but like a sculptor who understood form and physics, imagined a weapon that would not replace artillery but place it directly in the hands of infantry, something light enough for 2 men to carry, simple enough to operate without specialist training, accurate enough to fire danger close, without killing friendly troops, and mobile enough to advance with the attack. And the shape he envisioned was almost embarrassingly minimal: a smooth steel tube, a base plate, and a bipod, no breech, no recoil system, no trigger, just a shell dropped down the barrel, striking a fixed pin, igniting propellant, and letting physics complete the act. The French army tested his prototype and found it revolutionary precisely because it looked primitive. A 60mm tube weighing 42 pounds that could be mastered by a 19-year-old conscript in an afternoon, capable of firing 15 rounds per minute, lofting 3-pound shells in steep arcs that fell nearly straight down into trenches, ravines, and reverse slopes, delivering modest explosions exactly where infantry needed them most, and while no single shell was devastating. The weapon could go anywhere a rifleman could go, and that changed everything, leading to its adoption as the Mortier Brandt Modely 1927, which soon caught the attention of foreign observers, including American officers who remembered too well the price paid in 1918 for attacking without close fire support, and after meticulous testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the United States Army purchased not merely a license but full production rights, adopting the design in 1932 as the M260 mm mortar, a designation forgettable on paper but transformative in reality, because American industry refined and mass-produced the weapon until by 1941 every U.S. rifle company carried its own mortar section, and by the time Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the M2 was as common as rifles, just another piece of gear slung ashore. No one suspecting it would decide a campaign. Edgar Brandt himself would never see Guadalcanal, never meet the men whose lives his invention would save, remaining in Paris through occupation and returning after the war to art and ironwork, dying in 1960 remembered more as an artist than a weapons designer. Yet on the night of October 24, 1942, his idea lay hidden in jungle mud 7,000 miles from France, waiting to be tested against soldiers who believed unwaveringly that courage and cold steel could overcome industrial firepower. The Japanese 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, had planned the October offensive with methodical confidence, viewing Guadalcanal as a problem solvable through massed infantry assault, assigning Major General Masao Maruyama's veteran Sendai Division to march through jungle terrain the Americans believed impassable, strike at night, overwhelm thin defenses, and seize Henderson Field by dawn, a plan that mirrored successes in Malaya and Singapore, built on speed, shock, and a doctrine that embraced casualties as proof of honor, and intelligence estimated the targeted ridge was held by perhaps 700 or 800 Marines, while Maruyama would attack with over 6,000 men, confident that once bayonets reached flesh the outcome would be inevitable. What Japanese intelligence did not understand was what those Marines carried, because the Imperial Army possessed no equivalent to the company-level mortar and thus underestimated its role entirely, assuming heavy weapons belonged far behind the front, not nestled just meters from riflemen, and so Maruyama's division advanced burdened only with rifles, grenades, and bayonets, leaving behind its own artillery because it could not be dragged through the jungle, committing fully to a pure infantry assault, marching silently for days through choking vegetation, subsisting on cold rice, convinced of success. Unbeknownst to them, their movement had already been detected, and at 21:30 on October 24th, Sergeant Ralph Briggs quietly reported hearing thousands of men moving south of the Marine line, a message Puller accepted without hesitation, because Puller, a 24-year Marine veteran already legendary for his leadership in jungle fighting, trusted instinct and experience over theory, and he understood that his sector of the perimeter would soon become the focal point of the battle for Guadalcanal. Puller's battalion occupied a low ridge carefully prepared over months, machine guns sighted for interlocking fire, rifle pits reinforced, and behind them 9 M2 mortars positioned just 200 meters back, close enough for direct coordination, and while the weapon specifications appeared modest on paper, 3-pound shells, limited range, small blast radius, they concealed a decisive advantage: the ability to deliver rapid, accurate, high-angle fire exactly where needed, again and again, without complex machinery or delay. As night deepened, mortar crews checked fuses, stacked ammunition by touch, and memorized firing data, teenagers preparing for their first real test, while Puller walked the line issuing simple orders, pre-plotted concentrations, danger close fire if necessary, no withdrawal, because Henderson Field lay just 400 meters behind them, and if the ridge fell, the campaign fell with it. The Japanese assault began at 2300 hours with light artillery fire meant more to mask movement than destroy defenses, and by midnight the first companies reached the wire, Bangalore torpedoes blasting gaps that instantly drew Marine machine gun fire, cutting down attackers in swaths, yet momentum carried survivors forward, Captain Jiro Katsumata leading his men with sword drawn into the breach, believing that closing the distance would bring victory, and for a moment it seemed possible as dozens surged uphill through smoke and chaos, until at 0:20 the mortars opened fire, 9 tubes delivering a synchronized storm of explosions directly onto the wire gap, shells landing with mathematical precision, turning the assault point into a continuous eruption of steel and dirt, obliterating the formation before it could mass, shredding Katsumata's company until only a handful remained alive beyond the wire. Those survivors pressed on regardless, because doctrine and honor allowed no retreat, but Marine machine guns and rifle fire finished what the mortars began, and within minutes the first assault company ceased to exist, its captain dead beneath the ridge, sword still in hand, while further Japanese waves met the same fate as mortars shifted fire with shouted corrections, dropping shells 50 meters from friendly positions. Sometimes closer, a calculated risk that saved the line. Throughout the night, regiment after regiment attacked with discipline and courage, using terrain, suppressive fire, and coordination, yet every concentration was shattered before it could launch, every penetration isolated and destroyed, and when General Yumio Nasu himself was mortally wounded by a mortar shell at his command post, coordinated command collapsed, leaving only fragmented assaults driven by orders that demanded victory or death, and by dawn the jungle before Puller's Ridge was littered with bodies, more than 2,000 Japanese casualties inflicted at the cost of a few dozen Marines, a result not born of superior bravery but of superior firepower employed at the decisive point. By morning, Henderson Field remained in American hands, and the Japanese offensive lay broken, not because the attackers lacked will, but because the assumptions that governed their doctrine had been rendered obsolete by a simple steel tube conceived decades earlier by a man who believed that the purpose of design was to preserve life, and on that night on Guadalcanal, Edgar Brandt's idea proved that infantry warfare had changed forever, because courage alone no longer decided battles, geometry did, and the mortar, unassuming, portable, and deadly precise, had rewritten the rules under which men lived or died.